Hi y'all, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to talk about all things related to child sexual abuse, what exactly is child sexual abuse, like what it constitutes, and ways that it can impact you even into adulthood. So if you're interested in this topic, then stay tuned. So my name is Jessica Lang. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I talk all things related to attachment, trauma, the brain, and healing on this channel. So if you are interested in those topics, then go ahead and click the subscribe button down below so you can be notified when I upload a new video. And don't forget to also ring the notification bell. Okay, so as always, just, content warning, because I am going to be talking about child sexual abuse. So, just be mindful of who's in your surroundings today. But I never go into too many details. I don't want to trigger anyone, but again, just be mindful and thoughtful about who's in your environment while watching this video. Okay, so we've probably all by this point heard the statistics about, it's anywhere from 1 in 4 girls to 1 in 5 boys will be sexually abused in some way throughout their childhood. And one of the things that I've always kind of found interesting over the course of my career is the amount of people who initially come in for like an initial assessment where maybe they're struggling with some depression or anxiety or, lack of motivation, or they're struggling in their relationships and that they just want help with, with that particular topic. And as we continue with the assessment, I ask certain questions, they might just kind of glossingly say, oh yeah, I was molested by my uncle, or, yeah, my dad touched me, or whatever it is, and they kind of minimize it, not realizing kind of the ramifications of those early that early sexual abuse and how it could be impacting them now. It could actually be part of why they're experiencing depression, anxiety. I've said it in previous videos that one of the things that we do know about trauma, particularly PTSD, and even though in the current version of the DSM-5, there is no, we didn't get a complex trauma diagnosis, which for those of us who work in the community are not so pleased with, but it is what it is. People will typically get a PTSD diagnosis if they have trauma, but a lot of the symptoms that are in the PTSD category are also similar to those of anxiety and depression, ADHD even. And so oftentimes people get misdiagnosed, or I've seen charts where somebody's had 5 or 6 different diagnoses, and I'm like, but they've got trauma. So you're like, if you just name it trauma, then that actually covers pretty much all that's going on with this individual. So I've talked about that in previous videos, and so I'll link in the description box, and also at the end I'll put a card at the end for my series that I did that was about trauma and misdiagnoses. So you can I kind of compare certain disorders like depression, anxiety, ADHD, and what's under in trauma basically. And so you can kind of see that overlap and how folks tend to be misdiagnosed. Even though folks have experienced sexual abuse throughout their childhood, like I said, they don't initially come in for help with that. They come for help because they feel like they're depressed or they're struggling with their relationships. And then as we continue with the assessment, we discovered that or they disclose that they were abused as a child, and they never reported. And so one of the things I always think about is, even though we have the statistics on how common it is, these are folks who've reported. So what about people who have not reported? And I don't know if anybody's following what's going on currently, like in YouTube land, about certain things that have been going on with certain influencers and certain YouTubers, and there's allegations and things like that are going on. And obviously this video is not going to talk about any of that stuff, but one of the things to kind of keep in mind is that even adults have a hard time with disclosing and reporting any type of sexual assault or abuse going on. So just imagine for a child, a 5-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 3-year-old, and them trying to talk about or disclose what has happened to them. So just wanted to keep that kind of in context about, yeah, we have the statistics, but it's most likely even more of a problem than we actually know, which is why I talk about it a lot on this channel. So in category 1, we have problems with emotional regulation. So due to having an overactive or a sensitized stress response system, as we like to call it, folks here tend to struggle with feeling the extremes of their emotions. So for most folks, right, something happens, some type of trigger happens in our life. We might, feel a memory, feel sad, or we get angry. And so we feel that anger, but it doesn't overwhelm us. It doesn't activate our systems enough for more extreme behaviors to kind of happen. We can kind of what we say, like, modulate those emotions. We can manage those emotions. We can act despite of how we're feeling with some semblance of kind of control, for lack of a better word. Sorry, I'm kind of oversimplifying things, but I'm just trying to make a distinction. With folks who struggle with emotional regulation, what happens is some type of event or stressor happens. So in category 1, we have problems with emotional regulation. So this is due to an overactive or a sensitized stress response system. Sensing threats all the time, survivors are generally really responsive or reactive to, are sensitive to stressors that are in their environment. And these stressors are these threats that they experience, that they actually feel like it's a life or death type of situation, and so they respond accordingly. The stress response system is deployed, fight, fight, freeze. And so rather than kind of being able to move fluidly between emotions, they experience really high highs and really low lows. Most folks who are kind of who don't have trauma, we all have like a baseline, right? And so something happens and we get a spike, we get activated. So we go up here and then we come back down to our baseline. But when you have repeated traumas throughout your life, right? It's like you get a trauma, you move up, and then as you're coming down, you get another trauma, and then you go back up, and so what happens is this part, as you're kind of going through the wave, because you never really get to go back down to your baseline. Your baseline now shifts, so it might move up higher, or it actually might move lower. So if it moves up higher, then that means you're typically more what we call hyper aroused. You are more, this is very general, but this is where you see more of those externalizing behaviors. You might see more anger outbursts, or people who are yelling, or fights, or more aggression. Again, this is being very general, but that's because your stress response system has been activated, and now you're in fight mode, or you might also be in flee mode, but you're in the fight mode, and so you're acting, I gotta defend myself. Whereas folks who, maybe their baseline maybe shifts, and so they move lower, they're more hypo aroused. That means they're more likely to kind of dissociate, to numb out, to kind of disconnect. That's more of that freeze response. And so all of these things happen automatically. It's like information comes in, it goes, this is typical, information comes in, it goes to our brainstem, goes to our limbic system, goes up to and then we process it out our cortex. That's the typical range of things. But and it happens fast, but again, with trauma, or when the stress response system is activated, the information doesn't even have a chance to get up to the cortex before you're acting. You are just responding in fight or flight mode, off of the limbic, off of that brainstem, before you can process. And so what your cortex does, part of its job, is to manage your emotions. It is for you to be able, okay, like think of a toddler, right? Who you say, no, you can't have a cookie before dinner, and they fall apart on the ground and they're throwing a big old tantrum. That's their limbic system. They don't have the capacity yet of understanding like the importance of dinner, and what waiting means. Like for them, it's like, I cannot believe their little systems are flipping out. And so that's kind of what's happening for you. Again, I'm not trying to equate your experience to that of a toddler or a baby, but that's just how fast that kind of goes, and what happens when you're kind of stuck in that limbic system, and how you just react without thinking. So as you get older and your cortex kind of it expands, and you have more more information, and it grows and it develops, part of its job is to actually interpret what's going on and to tamper those emotions so you're not acting on reflex. But if you don't have that ability, because your stress response system has been hijacked by all of those early traumatic experiences, then you don't have time. You're acting before the information gets up to the cortex. So part of the healing journey is, and why we talk a lot about like grounding exercises, or we do more body-based work and things like that, is because what we want to do is give time for that cortex to come online. We need to create new associations so that we can kind of shift, just like your baseline was shifted up because of the trauma. Now that you're out of that traumatic experience, out of that that environment, right, you're not around, we want to shift it back to something that's a little bit more functional, more flexible, more adaptive, so that you can then act in a way that is more according to your own your who you are, not the place of being hijacked by your stress response system. So I hope that that made sense and I didn't offend anybody or yeah. Category 2 is low self-esteem. So this can show up in a variety of ways. But what we're kind of talking about is, a lot of being plagued with a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, feeling like something's wrong with you, feeling like, you're different. These kind of feelings and belief because of the sexual abuse, because of those early traumatic experiences, you have experienced something different that not most, but a lot of folks haven't experienced. And so you do feel different. You see things different. We all notice what's going on around us. You see those things and you start to internalize. People treat you a certain way. So you internalize all of that and then you carry that into adulthood. You carry that into your adult interactions with other people. There's a lot that kind of goes into that low self-esteem, but what I see also with folks who struggle with that low self-esteem is like difficulty standing up for oneself, poor boundaries, fear of being alone. So they kind of stay stuck with folks who are not particularly healthy. I mean, there's a whole wide range, like not going after promotions or not, feeling like they can't do more than where they're at, not dreaming. Those are kind of the things that I tend to see that fall into the category of low self-esteem, but it's all around that shame and that guilt, if that makes sense. Category 3 is sexual intimacy related problems, sex related difficulties. So that's where you're going to get into, so I narrowed this down even further with the sexual behaviors as, a lot of folks either have sexual aversions or they are overly sexualized. And there's a lot of thought in the community about kind of why that is. For some, there's a belief around like the overly sexual behavior. It's part of like recreating, reenacting. It's all part of kind of the reenactment process. Again, there's different theories about why this is, but there's some type of mastery a person's trying to gain by going into repeated sexual experiences. This is not a judgment or anything like that, but again, like people who go into like sex trade or go into, not sex trade, sorry, people who become professional sex workers or strippers, there's some thought around, they get into that because there's some control, they're controlling the sexual interaction, and then that's their body and their brain's way of trying to make sense of what happened when they were a child and have some mastery over that experience, and so they find themselves in those type of positions or in those type of professions. Again, this is not a judgment, this is just kind of theories and what people in the field kind of think about what that is. And then you have folks who have some sexual aversions where they don't want to have sex at all, sex is painful, they dissociate during sex, they can't orgasm. I mean, there's a ton of other things that kind of go along with it, but again, especially with the sexual aversions, especially with the dissociation, because of the past trauma, when you're in those intimate relationships with somebody else, your brain has made an association with that childhood experience of somebody hurting you, somebody doing something you don't want. And so even though you are with a loving partner or a caring partner or sex is something you want to do, your sensitized stress response system kicks in and you dissociate. And when you dissociate, like you're not connected. So of course you're not going to have an orgasm, right? Like you're not present enough to do that. And so finding a sex therapist who's skilled with trauma work is one avenue to, and working obviously with a partner, an intimate partner who you trust. That's one way of kind of overcoming and working with that. You can also, do that, like I said, in therapy, but that's one way to kind of manage the sexual aversion piece of things. And then for the folks who are kind of overly sexualized, again, no judgment either way. What I want is for you just to have some type of understanding about, this might be why I'm engaging in this. And as long as you're like, yeah, I enjoy my sex work, or I enjoy stripping, or I don't want to have sex, as long as you're okay with where you're at, then, what I'm saying shouldn't offend you. Just giving you some context. So maybe you can have some understanding about why maybe, you or somebody has maybe gone down that path of things. But these are just kind of ways in which folks try to manage or control or to heal so many ways you can think about it, that early traumatic experience. This is ways in which that it shows up in a person's lived experience. And I just, want to also add just on the point too about kind of overly sexual behaviors. Like I said, not a judgment. As long as you're doing it with intent, with awareness, you feel empowered by it, okay, bam, go do your thing. But if you're engaging in these behaviors and you don't feel empowered, you don't like yourself, you feel, disgusted or gross, or, any of those kind of you have those negative associations, that's the problem. So it's not the act, it's not the sex, it's that it's what it's doing for you. It's the meaning you're making about the interactions that you're having, that I'm more focused on. And so that's just why I wanted to kind of talk about that as well. Category 4 are attachment and relationship problems. This is, this is big basically with anybody with any type of trauma, but primarily with sexual abuse. Again, you're talking about a violation, and it's typically by somebody who is supposed to protect you, love you, someone you're supposed to trust. They're supposed to keep you safe. I mean, very, very rarely is the perpetrator somebody somebody you've never met or you didn't have some type of relationship with at some point. So that's why it's such a problem, and you bring that with you. It sets like a template. Again, associations get created with repeated co-occurring things. Like that creates an association, that creates a memory, a memory that we actually remember, or even like something that our body remembers. It creates a memory. It's an association that has been made. And so you go out there in the world and you interact with people, and that's always kind of playing in the background. Is this person going to hurt me? Can I trust this person? Are they safe? One of the things I really see too, which is interesting with survivors of child sexual abuse, is and this is also kind of a boundary thing, where they've just met somebody, a partner, another friend, and then they spill out their life story, and they say, I was sexually abused as a kid. And it's interesting. It's an interesting phenomenon that I notice it happens when people are kind of early on in their healing journey. They kind of blurt it out to people in inappropriate contexts. And I have a theory about why that is. I believe part of why they do that is it creates, it's part of their way of kind of creating a boundary, but it's an inappropriate way of creating a boundary by saying, I was sexually abused. You're assessing the person's reaction. So is the person going to come and like play rescue towards you, which, people kind of, I'd be a little bit careful about that, or does it kind of create a distance, create a barrier? So now that's all people see you as, and so you can't really develop an intimate relationship because you've now disclosed something too early and in inappropriate context, if that makes sense. It's kind of a fine line. People, not everybody should have access to you or have access to your story. People need to earn your trust, and that takes time. That takes different types of experiences. And so again, if you're just kind of blurting out that story, I would be thinking, is this person trying to create some distance? Because that makes people uncomfortable. I was sexually abused. Huh? We're talking about something different, right? So your mind will go, see, I knew this person wasn't good. Look, they don't even care. Look how your mind kind of creates a story out of that reaction, and it creates that distance. Or again, it serves to kind of pull people in. They have like this rescuer mentality, but those folks tend to be people who are exploitative anyway. So, narcissists, for example, that's something that they're looking for. People who go out and, who try to recruit people for like pornography or sex trafficking, like on the extreme version. They're looking for people who've had some type of victimization in the past. Cult leaders. I mean, there's a whole variety of people who are exploitative for a variety of different reasons, who would hear that and go, right? And so you put yourself at risk for being re-victimized again. So being really thoughtful about who you share your story with, who you disclose that information to, why you want to disclose that information. Because the other part of it too, I've had this happen where somebody, like they disclose that they were sexually abused, and then just they said it and now they've dissociated, and being dissociative puts you at risk of being victimized. So you might say that, and then somebody's doing something you don't really want, and you're dissociated and you can't protect yourself. So that's also kind of a reason why I would, encourage you to be really thoughtful about who you disclose, why you're disclosing it, what happens, when you do disclose, what happens when you say, I was sexually abused as a child. Number 5 is general patterns of re-victimization. The brain is amazing. It's wonderful. We love our brains, but our brain it likes to kind of conserve energy. And so if we've had repeated experiences with something, that is something that becomes familiar. We want familiarity, no matter what that looks like. As long as if it's familiar, we know what to do with that, right? So chaotic environments, people who say one thing and do another, if we've had a history of that victimization, right, or that history of child sexual abuse where, on the one hand the person's very loving, very caring, and then they come in, they coerce us into doing something, or they violate us sexually, well, that's very confusing. But your brain knows what to do, because that's what it's experienced repeatedly, right? So it knows how to handle that situation. And so you end up kind of falling for the types of people who will prey on you, essentially, for lack of a better word, right? They play upon and abusers are they are master manipulators. That's what makes them so good. They can, you can read blogs or articles or books from people who've actually talked to rapists and people who've abused children, things like that, and they will talk about the things that they notice in an individual that made them think that this person would be a good target, which is quite scary. But they're good about that, and so they kind of know what to pick up on. Even me as a therapist, like when if I hear a certain account of somebody's life, they might not ever say sexual abuse, but they start describing certain things, I will go, this person's probably got some trauma. And then I'll ask them about it, and I'll be, have you been? And they'll say yes. So, when you just know these kinds of things. I hope that's not offensive or, hurting anybody's feelings or anything like that, but that is the very, very real reality. So our brains know what to do in those situations where, that they've seen before. They know how to act. It's the ones that that they've never seen, that actually creates that anxiety and is like, wait, what do I do with this? This is novel, right? So if you had exposure to repeated amounts of trauma, a certain type of person, your brain is going to be attracted to that because it knows what to do. Oh, I've seen this before, right? It's really what your brain is doing. So if you've had all this chaos, then you're going to lean towards people who are really chaotic because your brain wants that. It knows that. Trying to find folks who are not chaotic, and we see this with, kids like in the foster care system, for example, who've gone, between, and we've seen this with children in the foster care a lot, where they have the trauma of their home environment, parents who are abusive, what have you. They go to a place where there's nothing but love and patience and nobody hurts them, and then they end up creating situations, they act out in some type of way, and then now, they have to leave that home. It's like, see, I knew. Your brain just kind of does stuff like that, and a child doesn't have the cognitive capacity to understand that that's what's going on. That's why therapy is so important, because what you want to do is create new associations. We got to be able to identify the pattern of what you typically do, what you typically are drawn to, and then you go about systematically create, like, having a different types of experience so that you can shift. So you're shifting away from that initial template of like people are dangerous, unsafe, blah blah blah, to a more nuanced approach of like, yes, some people are dangerous, some people are, really, really good, and it takes time for you to be able to build up and figure out who you can trust and who you can't trust. But you have to create those new associations. You're going to have to actually be able to feel and to tolerate your anxiety and your is this person a good person or not? As opposed to, oh, like, I, immediately fell in love with this person, then you find out they're a narcissist or what have you. Well, if we look, somebody who doesn't have any type of abuse would look at those early things that happened and go, well, this was a red flag, that was a red flag. But you might be like, oh, I never saw that as a red flag, because your brain has always just kind of known what that is, if that makes sense. So that's how folks kind of fall into and do repeated patterns and kind of put themselves at risk for re-victimization, because they're not aware of those patterns. Finally, we're looking at addiction, so like substance abuse, eating disorders, sex addiction, things like that. Now addiction in and of itself is not my forte, but what I do know, what we all know, is that what addiction targets is the reward, or the pleasure center of your brain. And so the reward system and your stress response system, those neural networks, they happen at the same time. They co-occur at the same time. They're related to each other. So, you have, let's use, development. You have a baby, comes out, baby wants to, our goal is to be in homeostasis, right? To be, our temperature to be regulated how we want it, not to be hungry, not to be cold, to be alert and active and engaged. Well, when a baby gets cold, they start crying, right? So now they're out of balance, and so they cry, and what happens is they're uncomfortable. So their stress response system gets triggered, and that's what leads to the crying. Caregiver comes, oh, what's wrong? Starts talking to them softly, maybe wraps them up in a blanket. So the association that now, and you have this happen repeatedly. So that's how an association is made, right? And that's the reward center that's also being targeted. So by calming down that stress response system, you get that relational reward of the caregiver at the same time of being bathed in warmth and loving touch and soft voice and rocking. All of those things come together. They create an experience. That's your reward system. That's your dopamine hit. That's your, all of that good stuff. That's the feeling of feeling good. That's you feeling happy. That's feeling content. But if you don't have that experience, let's say you are cold and you cry and nobody comes, or when they do come, it takes them forever, or they're yelling. Well, you're not really the association that's gonna be made is not one of ooh, warmth and happy and loving touch. It's an activated stress response system, and yeah, maybe the cold part has decreased, but you're not satiated, you're not happy, you're not content, you're not, because the person came and they're all aggravated, right? Or they ignored you and you just kind of disconnected and dissociated, and you don't have that experience. And so the reward center of your brain, which is what the addiction is kind of targeting, the dopamine, stuff like that, you have to find your reward, your pleasure, your joy in something else, because we all need it, right? We all need to feel that joy. And so for some people it's eating, for all of us, honestly, eating salty, sweet foods, that actually triggers our reward center. We feel pleasure from doing that, but it's a fleeting pleasure, right? It's not the same thing as, being in a loving embrace, or going for a nice walk, or snuggling with our pets, or watching a good movie, or reading a good book. It's not the same thing. And sex can operate in that same way. Substances, alcohol, smoking, even marijuana, I know, cocaine, all of those things, they all operate on that same kind of dynamic, where they give you that reward, and they give you that hit, but it's fleeting, right? Because you're still missing that relational component, and you still have all this stress response stuff that's also attached as well. So again, I know I kind of threw a lot at you. I just wanted to kind of jump on here, talk generally about child sexual abuse, especially in light of what's happening, more recently with people on YouTube and allegations and things like that. Why we should really be taking these types of things really serious when people do tell you, I was sexually abused, or, a child discloses, or, you suspect something. You really want to believe what the person is saying and get them access to help so that they can heal, because without it, these are the parts of a person's life that get affected. The ability to relate, to emotionally regulate, right? Which will then impact their relationships, because it's very exhausting if somebody's constantly wanting to fight you, or if you're trying to have conversations and the person's kind of in and out of the conversation, right? Or they're engaging in risky behavior, so you're constantly worried about them, or they get involved with addiction because they have a lot of pain and they're trying to avoid that pain with the addiction, and they're just trying to feel some type of pleasure any type of way, right? Or or they don't have any relationships, that everybody, has hurt them. They don't trust anybody. They don't feel connected. So they're lonely. They're sad. You know what I mean? So there's so many ways that child sexual abuse shows up in a person's life and can really be harmful years down the line, in ways that maybe you might not have even thought about. And so it's really important that if you are somebody who is struggling, who has a history of sexual abuse, is to really work through that, is to see the ways in which it's negatively impacted your life, and then go about getting some help so that you can feel content and happy and feel that joy without becoming overwhelmed, and not be so overwhelmed by the pain, and kind of release your guilt and your shame, and to have healthy relationships and loving relationships, and all of those things that I want for all of us, because I just want us all to just be content, and find the joy in the everyday things. So that is all I have for you all today. If you like this video, please go ahead and comment down below, because I love hearing from you. You can also join my Facebook group. It's the Survivor's Guide to Life. It's a place for women who are trauma survivors. It's not just strictly about sexual abuse, although I talk about that. If you've experienced any type of trauma, then that's a good place for you to join and have conversations with other people who have that experience, build that community. You can also join my email list, which I highly recommend that you join my email list, because I do send out freebies and just things that you can learn a little bit more than what's happening with the YouTube videos or even my blogs. You can, I write blogs also. So all of that information is in the description box down below, how you can join, how you can sign up. So you can just be a part of the community, and you can start to heal, because I just want nothing but the best for you. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.